Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Speak English with Sophie. I'm Sophie, and I'm here with Chris. Today, we're diving into a topic that I think so many of us can relate to: how to remember everything you read.
That's right, we've all been there. You read a chapter, or even a whole book, and a few days later, you can't seem to recall much of anything. Today, we're going to talk about how we can shift from just consuming information to actually digesting it in a way that sticks.
Yes, it's not just about reading more, but about reading in a way that helps us retain what we've read. We'll cover some practical tips, look at the science behind it, and share the PACER framework. And, as always, we've got vocabulary words to help boost your English.
Stick with us until the end, where we'll go over 10 key words from today's discussion, giving you the pronunciation, meanings, and examples. Alright, Sophie, let's jump right in.
So, let's start by talking about the main point here. The problem isn't that we don't read enough, but that we don't digest what we read.
Exactly. There's a big difference between reading something and really absorbing it. I like to think of it as a meal. When you eat too fast, you don't digest it properly, and you just feel uncomfortable. Information works the same way.
Yes, the brain isn't designed to just soak up information and store it. We need to actively process it. If we're only consuming without digesting, it's like we're on an information binge diet.
I love that comparison, and research actually shows that if we don't take time to process what we learn, we lose around 90% of it. That's almost everything.
So the first takeaway here is to remember, it's not about what comes in, it's about what stays in. We want to focus on digesting information rather than just taking in more and more.
To add to this, there's a really interesting example in the video of someone who could actually remember everything he read. His name was Kim Peek, and he was a savant with an exceptional memory.
Yes, his memory was absolutely astonishing. He could read 2 pages of a book at once, one with each eye, and retain it all.
Can you imagine that? 2 pages at once. But, despite this skill, it didn't necessarily mean he understood all that he read.
Right. It's fascinating because it shows that remembering every detail doesn't always lead to true understanding. You can have a great memory, but if you're not able to apply that information, it loses its value.
Exactly. So, remembering everything word for word isn't really the goal here. It's more about being able to use what you've read.
All right, Chris, this is where things get really interesting. One of the most powerful ideas in today's topic is the PACER framework. It's all about understanding that not all information is the same, and depending on the type, we need different ways to process it.
Yes, and it's fascinating. I think a lot of us try to remember everything in the same way. No matter what we're learning, we read, highlight, and hope that it sticks. But the truth is, different types of information need different kinds of processing to really sink in.
Absolutely. PACER breaks information into 5 categories: procedural, analogous, conceptual, evidence, and reference. Let's go over each one and talk about the best ways to process them.
Sounds good. So, let's start with procedural information. This is any type of information that involves learning how to do something. Think of it as step-by-step knowledge, like learning how to play a musical instrument, fix a bike, or even learning a new recipe.
Exactly. Procedural information is everywhere, and it's all about action. You can't just read about it. You actually have to practice it. That's the key here. Practice is the best way to retain procedural information.
Yes, just like learning how to drive a car or ride a bike. No matter how many driving theory books you read, you'll never truly understand it until you get behind the wheel and practice.
So for our listeners, if you're learning a skill or task, make sure to practice as soon as possible. The more you do, the more natural it will feel, and you'll remember it long term.
Alright, next up is analogous information. This is where you relate new information to something you already know. It's about connecting the unfamiliar with the familiar.
Yes, and this is so helpful because it allows us to use what we already know to better understand new ideas. For example, when learning a new language, you might relate it to a language you already know. Or when studying history, You might think about how certain events are similar to something you've seen in modern life.
Right, and the best way to process analogous information is through critical thinking. You want to analyze the analogy carefully, understand where it's strong, where it's weak, and see how well it actually applies to the new information.
That's a good point. Analogies aren't perfect, but they're really helpful for understanding and remembering. They give us a starting point, and then we can dig deeper from there.
So, if you're learning something new, try to think of an analogy. Even if it's a bit silly, the comparison will help the information stick because it's now connected to something you already understand.
Okay, moving on to conceptual information. Now, this is one of the biggest categories. It includes facts, theories, principles, explanations, essentially, the big ideas.
Yes, and conceptual information is like a web of interconnected ideas. Unlike procedural or analogous info, which can often stand alone, conceptual information is more like a network. One idea often links to several others.
And that's why visual tools like mind maps are perfect for this. When you create a mind map, you start with a central idea and branch out to connect related concepts. It mirrors the way your brain naturally organizes information.
I love mind maps because they break away from the usual linear way of note-taking. Textbooks and lectures often present information in a linear way, but our brains actually store knowledge in clusters, or a web of information, just like you said.
Exactly. So, if you're reading a complex topic, try creating a mind map to organize the ideas. It's not just about recording information, it's about seeing how everything is connected.
And mind maps also make it easier to review later. Instead of reading through pages of notes, you can look at the map and instantly see the main points and connections.
All right. Next we have evidence information. This is a bit different from conceptual information. It includes specific data, examples, statistics, or any factual detail that backs up a concept or theory.
Yes, and evidence often helps us understand the importance of a concept. Let's say you're reading about climate change. The concept might be that global temperatures are rising, but the evidence would be specific data like temperature records or research findings.
And because evidence is so detailed, it's easy to forget it. That's why we need a system for storing and rehearsing this information. A good way to do this is by using tools like flashcards, which you can review over time to keep the data fresh.
I'm a huge fan of flashcards, especially for facts and stats, and if you use something like spaced repetition, you can schedule reviews at intervals, so you're more likely to remember it long term.
Spaced repetition is fantastic. You start with short intervals, like reviewing the next day, and then gradually increase the time between reviews as the information sticks.
And for our listeners, if you're learning English vocabulary, for example, this approach works wonders. The more you revisit those words at spaced intervals, the more they'll stay with you.
Finally, let's talk about reference information. This is information that may not be immediately useful but might be important later. Think of it like background knowledge or details that you might need to look up in the future.
Yes, and for reference information, it's often about having a good storage system. Just like evidence, you can use flashcards or apps for this. Another method is keeping organized notes that you can easily search through.
Exactly. Reference information often needs to be retrieved rather than constantly rehearsed. So as long as you have a system in place, you'll be able to access it when needed.
And that wraps up the PACER framework. Remembering to tailor our processing method to the type of information really makes all the difference.
So true, Chris. All right, Chris. Let's get into the heart of today's topic, balancing consumption and digestion. This is such an important concept because I think many of us get caught up in just consuming more and more information.
Absolutely. With so much content available, it's easy to keep reading, listening, and watching, thinking that we're learning. But in reality, consuming without digesting is like eating a big meal without giving your body the time to absorb it. Eventually, it just goes to waste.
Exactly. And this idea is at the core of today's topic. When it comes to learning and remembering what we read, it's less about how much we consume and more about how much we retain and apply.
Right, and the thing is, in today's world, it's so easy to consume endlessly. We're surrounded by articles, videos, podcasts, social media posts. It's non-stop. but if we don't take the time to really process what we're learning, we end up forgetting most of it.
That's where digestion comes in. Digesting information means processing it in a way that sticks. It's about slowing down, reflecting on what you've learned, and using different strategies to make it meaningful.
Exactly, Sophie. And here's a great analogy. It's like eating at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Imagine if you just keep piling food on your plate without stopping to enjoy or actually taste it. Eventually, you're full, but you don't really appreciate or remember what you ate.
That's such a good comparison, Chris. Just like overeating. Overconsumption of information leads to something we could call mental bloating. You feel overwhelmed by the amount of stuff you've taken in, and it becomes hard to remember or apply any of it.
And here's the thing. True learning only happens when you balance these two stages, consumption and digestion. If we're constantly taking in new information without digesting it, we're not truly learning, we're just piling on knowledge without depth.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people feel frustrated when they can't remember what they've read or watched, especially if they spend a lot of time on it. But it's often because they haven't spent enough time processing it. Digestion is key.
So true. And here's a helpful way to think about it. When we're consuming, we're basically adding new ideas to our minds, but digestion is about turning those ideas into usable knowledge.
Right. When we digest information, we start linking it to what we already know, breaking it down into parts we can understand and apply. And without that, even the most interesting facts or concepts can slip away pretty quickly.
Exactly. And what's really important to remember is that this balance looks different for everyone. Some people might need more time processing what they've learned, while others might be able to move through the stages a bit faster.
Definitely, Chris. And I think this is a great reminder that learning is a personal journey. You don't have to rush. Sometimes, slowing down actually helps you retain and use the information far more effectively.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about some practical ways to balance consumption and digestion. One method that's really effective is setting aside dedicated time for digesting new information. For instance, after reading a chapter in a book, instead of moving on, take a few minutes to reflect.
Yes, that's a great habit. Maybe jot down a few notes, summarize what you've learned, or even talk about it with someone else. I find that when I explain something out loud, it really helps me understand it better.
Totally. Talking about it out loud is a powerful way to process information. You're forced to put it in your own words, which makes it more likely to stick. Another technique is reviewing regularly instead of cramming. It's like revisiting your knowledge to keep it fresh.
Yes, and that's a big one. When we review consistently, we're reinforcing what we've already learned rather than just adding more on top of it. And it's okay to reread or revisit the same content multiple times. Each time, you'll notice something new.
Absolutely. Review sessions can be short but regular. For instance, instead of reading for an hour straight, you could read for 30 minutes and then spend the next 10 to 15 minutes reviewing and summarizing what you've learned.
That's such a good idea. And what I love about this approach is that it makes learning feel less overwhelming. You're not just passively going through content, you're actively engaging with it.
Exactly. And another strategy for balancing consumption and digestion is setting learning goals. Instead of consuming information randomly, decide on a clear goal for what you want to learn or remember.
Oh, I love that. Chris, when you have a goal, you're more intentional about what you choose to read or watch, and it helps you stay focused. For example, if you're reading a book on history, set a goal to remember 3 key events or figures rather than trying to memorize every detail.
Right, and having a goal also helps you decide when you need to pause and digest. If you reach your goal, you know it's time to process what you've learned instead of just moving on.
Exactly. And here's another great trick for balancing the two. Try alternating between consuming and digesting in short bursts. For instance, read a few pages and then pause to think or jot down notes. This way, you're constantly processing rather than waiting until the end.
That's a fantastic approach, Sophie. Breaking it up makes it less exhausting, too. You're not just absorbing information nonstop. You're taking regular breaks to make sense of it all.
Definitely. And I think this ties back to something we mentioned earlier, quality over quantity. It's better to read one book deeply and remember it well than to skim through 5 books and barely recall anything.
Exactly. Sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to learning. We're so used to thinking that more information means more knowledge, but that's not true if we can't remember or apply it.
And let's not forget, Chris, that this process doesn't just apply to reading. Whether you're watching a documentary, attending a lecture, or listening to a podcast, the same principle of balancing consumption and digestion applies.
So true, Sophie. In fact, even for our listeners right now, if they're trying to remember the tips we're sharing, they might benefit from pausing, taking notes, or discussing it with a friend.
Exactly. The main takeaway is that learning isn't just about collecting information, it's about making it your own, and that only happens when we give ourselves the time and space to digest it.
Well said, Sophie. And for everyone listening, we hope this encourages you to rethink your approach to learning. Try to find that balance between consuming and digesting. It'll make a huge difference.
Yes, and remember, learning is a journey. There's no need to rush. It's about truly understanding what you're learning, not just gathering more and more facts.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive on balancing consumption and digestion. Take your time with your learning, and don't be afraid to go slowly if it helps you remember better.
Exactly, Chris. All right, everyone, let's wrap up with a vocabulary review. We covered some great words today that can help improve both your memory and English.
We'll go through each word, give the pronunciation, meaning, and a sentence. Ready? Let's start.
Consumption. Repeat after us. Consumption. Consumption is the act of taking in information or materials. For example, too much information consumption without processing leads to forgetting.
Digestion. Repeat after us. Digestion. Digestion is the process of understanding and internalizing information. For instance, effective learning requires both consumption and digestion.
Retention. Repeat after us. Retention. Retention is the ability to remember information. For example, practicing helps improve retention of what we read.
Absorbing. Repeat after us. Absorbing. Absorbing means fully taking in or understanding something. For instance, it's better to absorb a few ideas deeply than to skim through many.
Analogous. Repeat after us. Analogous. Analogous means similar in some way, making it easier to understand. For example, learning a language is analogous to learning music.
Critique. Repeat after us. Critique. Critique is a detailed analysis or assessment. For instance, it's good to critique new information to see how it fits with what you know.
Mind map. Repeat after us. Mind map. A mind map is a diagram used to visually organize information. For example, creating a mind map helped me connect different concepts.
Retention tool. Repeat after us. Retention tool. A retention tool is something that aids in remembering information. For example, flashcards are a great retention tool.
Spaced repetition. Repeat after us. Spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is a learning technique that spaces out reviews over time. For example, spaced repetition is effective for long-term memory.
Procedural. Repeat after us. Procedural. Procedural means related to how to do something. For example, procedural information requires practice for mastery.
Great job, everyone! Keep practicing these words, and soon they'll be a natural part of your vocabulary. This is the end of today's episode, but remember, learning English doesn't stop here. There's so much more to explore, so make sure to check out our other episodes to keep your English journey going. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay updated with our latest lessons. Keep practicing, keep growing, and we'll see you in the next episode. Happy learning!